In 1998, I was hired as an EEO counselor by the Office of Resolution Management under the Department of Veterans Affairs. My duties were to process discrimination complaints, which took place or affected the workplace. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was founded on July 2, 1965, as a result of the Civil Rights Acts of July 2, 1964, signed into law and founded by former President Lyndon Johnson and witnessed by the late Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I know I personally benefited from the work of the late Dr. King, a great man, in my opinion. In 2012, while on travel, I visited the Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Center for Social Change in Atlanta, Georgia. This was not just a museum visit. I looked at the many pictures of the 1960s riots and marches posted alongside the stairway in Ebenezer Baptist Church, the place where I am sure planning took place. A feeling took over me, which I can only describe as I stepped back in time. While I walked into the sanctuary, I could still envision Dr. King at the podium speaking to a room full of hurt, disappointed, and scared people. They were crying out for an answer to their lifelong problem of racism. Although they did not cause it, yet continued to suffer as a result. I could hear his distinctive voice, and see his hopeful stare into the eyes of the hopeless, searching their eyes for some indication that they were either in agreement with him or could at least hear him and try to agree to his nonviolent stand. He looked as though he was looking for reassurance from them that the American dream was still possible for them. But total despair mixed with the real threat of physical violence can blind a person's vision and hearing. It chokes out the possibility of reasonable thought and alters one's ability to devise a plan with a rational nonviolent outcome. This experience reminded me of the days in the 1960s. It was not just civil unrest, but racial riots that took place in my neighborhood, the Hoff and Glenville areas. I watched the Black Panthers wearing red, black, and green while marching up and down the streets. The armed forces rode through the neighborhood in armored tanks. Along with watching the March on Selma, the bus riots, and the March on Washington, D.C. on television. I still tear up when I hear others recite Dr. King's "I Had a Dream" speech. Then hearing the final blow, the announcement of the shooting of, and later death, of the late Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Even as a young child, I felt the deafening silence and pain, which was felt throughout the country. Then came the effects, the emotional response to the loss of a great leader, in the form of more riots and looting in the neighborhood. Although I was 5 or 6 years old when on December 1, 1965, Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus, the Black People Only section, these events began the civil rights movement, and they are still very much a part of my childhood. Rather, it was on the news, adults discussing the daily events at the kitchen table, or the live-in reminders, those 3 pictures, the late Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., former President John F. Kennedy, and yes, white Jesus, in an 8.5 by 11 wooden or plastic frames in the dining room. As I remember it, these same 3 pictures were in every Black person's home. Probably because each one of those men in the pictures held a very special place in our hearts, and thereby earned a place in our homes. They represented hope, and with hope came the possibility of change for colored people. Each man was respected in his own right based on his accomplishments, but nonetheless, they were the Black man's hope. As I remember, there were no other pictures on that same wall. They were placed high enough to see, but not low enough to touch, probably to ensure no one would be able to take them down. At the age of 63, I still remember the order of those 3 pictures: Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., former President John F. Kennedy, and yes, white Jesus. Although those photos were the only ones hanging on the wall, and it should have seemed like something was missing, but even as a child, I knew their pictures earned the right to stand alone. As I share these photos with you, I ask you to take into consideration the times, Dr. King's accomplishments, and the loss suffered not only by his family but mankind. I will say we will never know the level of change possible if Dr. King would have lived. We don't know why died, but when he died. But what we do know is that change can only happen with someone is willing to risk their all for the good of the many, taking a non-violent stand. I know many have their thoughts about Dr. King's personal life. Rather it is true or not is not the purpose of my post. Simply put, it is my stroll down memory lane, in remembrance of a great man, who stood up so that Rosa Parks, people of color, could sit down in the front of the bus, during a difficult time for good of the many. This is not a debate but my observation. LydieBug 2022